Hello everyone, Romeo Ribeiro here again with another video for you. Today I'm going to share yet another set of standards which is around conference rooms. Because there's so much to cover and go over, we've decided to make this a two-part video. Much like our previous standard around MDF, if you haven't watched that video, I recommend you do. We're going to have to share this in sort of two steps, right? As I said, the first video and the second video, there's a lot to cover in just one video. In the second video, we'll share and go over the actual sample of a small conference room. That's the idea there with the second video, all right? So, included in this video, again, much like I've touched on this before in the previous video about standards and MDF standards, we're going to have to make some assumptions. So we'll review those. We're going to review the conference room standard items, what we call standards. We're going to then review our 10-step process for building the conference room standards with you. So let's get started with assumptions and roles and responsibilities. I'm going to have to assume that it is your responsibility to build and manage conference rooms for your organization. This is from a roles and responsibility standpoint. If you don't have that responsibility, again, I suggest that you watch this video anyways, but be sure to involve the right folks that have that responsibility. All right? So that's on roles and responsibilities. I'm also going to assume that you have some level of familiarity with conference room terms, terminologies, and technologies. So we'll use those. So be sure to have some level of review of your own knowledge of these terminologies and technologies, all right? And then, of course, I'm going to have to assume that you have some knowledge of the value of the standards, okay? Outside of just these set of assumptions, we also have some more considerations. And we're going to start with this one. The level of maturity of your IT enterprise architecture. You need to be aware. You don't want to be too far behind or too far ahead of your own EA and its maturity level. All right? There's this concept that one size fits all. Yeah, that concept does not exist in standards. I may have mentioned this before in other videos, and that's true with this one too. You're going to have your own unique, very unique requirements, and so you're going to get it closer to maybe what we're going to show here, but then add your own stuff, or sometimes you remove from our samples here. You also want to understand how detailed you build these standards and why. Obviously, the more detailed, the better it is for those folks involved in building and managing these rooms. And so that's the why part. You're going to also consider your own ongoing practices inside your IT organization. And of course, you're going to do a periodic review of your standards as it relates to SDLC. You're going to treat this as a product. And then you want to be sure that you review, once you've built these standards, review them with your GC and architect. Your general contractor needs to be aware, if you're going to build a bunch of these rooms, needs to be aware of your requirements if you don't have them, obviously. And for the folks that do have standards, you may look at our standard here around conference rooms, and you may even have upgrades to yours or upgrades to our standards. We'll welcome that too. And also, you want to consider two sets of standards if possible. If you don't have international sites, you may not have to worry about this, but if you do, you may want to consider two separate standards. Domestic, for us, domestic is here in the US, and international, everything else, everywhere else. All right, so let's get to our list of standard items that sort of are part of building your standards, okay? And We always recommend that you start with your SLA agreement, your SLA service level agreement. And you want to know what you provide to the business in terms of support, uptime, etc. How fast or quick you actually fix a problem when it's there. And also, you want to know other things around SLA and for your products that go into the room from your vendor, right? Response time and everything that's related to an SLA. You also want to consider the location, capacity, and dimensions of these rooms. So location, where strategically is it best to place these conference rooms? And you're going to have different sizes, right? So we've developed standards from a 2-person or even a phone booth with some AV for 1-person, phone booth equivalent, all the way up to large training rooms, right? So you're going to have your 1-person, small, medium, large, extra large. You're going to have your custom rooms, including training rooms. Where do you want to place them? And then you're going to define the dimensions as well as part of your standard. And I'll talk about that in more detail in our second video, because that's where it really belongs and you'll see why. And just to give you a bit more on the dimensions, you want to consider scalable rooms so that if you start with a small 10 by 6, your next room will be twice as big and it'll be the small. And so you use the smallest unit of measure in this case, which would be your small phone booth equivalent, a 10 by 6, and then double that to a small, triple that to a medium, and so on until you get to your large and extra large. It works well. However, you always have to remember that the equipment and its capabilities, it's what's going to determine the dimensions of your rooms. Don't start the other way around. It never works. Trust me, we've done many of these, and we acknowledge that it's always the equipment that dictates the capabilities of the room, the dimensions rather, and in some cases, the capability of the room. You want to know the quantity of rooms per floor, per building, per campus, and its dimensions, right? The sizes that I mentioned. For example, in a 100,000 square foot floor, how many large versus small, medium, extra large do you place and where, right? You want to have a sense of, how dense or not so dense your floor needs to be. You're going to want to look at your own structural requirements for these rooms. And when I say that, I mean, lighting, HVAC. Some of the larger rooms, you want to be sure that you don't have your vents from your HVAC system next to the camera and the microphones, obviously, right? Those type of things. So again, you will see more details about that in our second video. But for now, start thinking about those structural requirements. You may know what those are. You're also going to want to know that not so much the types of displays, but the quantity and displays and the quantity of cameras. There are some rooms that you will probably not put any cameras, but most of your rooms will probably have cameras, right? Of whether you go with Zoom, Cisco, Microsoft, whatever, you want to standardize on that too, right? Because it makes no sense to have 2 or 3 different brands of equipment, because it's going to cost you more. It's going to cost you more downtime, more headaches in general. It's going to cost you more money to support. I mean, going back to the value of standards, you want to know what those values are and be able to sell them to your management team. So again, quantities of displays in cameras is key. We talked about this one a little bit. You want to know where to place those vents, right? And you are probably not going to have much of a say in terms of the volume, but if you design your small, medium, large, and extra large, you're going to work with your GC or your HVAC expert, and you're going to work together to help determine where those vents should go. Again, avoid placing them near the equipment. It does not make sense because, again, of the microphones, especially for AV equipment, video conferencing equipment that has microphones built into them. You want to avoid floor heaters as well. We've run into an issue in some of our international sites with some of our clients where they had these older style floor heaters, and we wanted to avoid placing AV equipment right above them. So that's another thing to consider. Lighting requirements, again, we always recommend LED. They look better on video as well because they're cooler. And in our example that I'm going to share in the second video, you have two switches for the lighting controls. And although displays are becoming brighter and better to see in terms of lumens, you always want to be able, especially for the larger rooms, to control lighting near the displays or the display in the room. All right? So consider that. But you ought to know where and how much to place these LED. We recommend the 2x2 panels, right? You can never have enough, but you need to know how to use them and place them well. The same is true with your electrical requirements. You need to know how many plugs, where. If you're wall mounting your displays, you want to work with your electrician to run your conduit all the way to, or pathway, as we call it, all the way to the table. Is that expensive? Sometimes it can be, but it's going to be more expensive if you add later as opposed to building from when you're building the room. So keep that in mind as well. We're going to talk about that in the second video. Low voltage as well is electrical. Same thing. You want to know how much data, physical connectivity, whether you use Cat6 or Cat7 or something else. And the same is true for if you extend the microphones from the equipment to the table, you'll want to be sure that you work with your electrician for the pathways under it. And flooring applies to noise more than it does to some level, to ADA, American Disabilities Act. I'll talk about that in the second video as well. You often hear, especially users with high heels, women mostly, that when they walk and there's a conference going on, you want to avoid that noise, right, as much as possible. Your physical security requirements, some rooms will have this requirement, most of them won't. But if you're talking about a room like a project room, for example, a project room is unique in a lot of ways, and where sometimes, whether you have smart boards on the wall or not, people are going to be placing proprietary data, right? They're going to be drawing on the board, and sometimes you want to protect that. And the same is true if you have a common area where you can have visitors visit the room. You want to be sure that you consider that as well. Again, it's not a major requirement for most conference rooms. And we talked about this a little bit, but you want to consider your requirements around horizontal and vertical pathways, these conduits. Not so much the vertical ones. You're going to have very few of those. It's more of the horizontal, pathways. And again, this is to and from your equipment, and of course for your structured cabling as well. Acoustical treatment requirements is always a good item to consider, especially if you work for organizations that have acoustical limits and requirements or at a dB level, right? So you want to consider that as well. And for smaller rooms as well, especially if you build rooms back to back or next to each other, you want to avoid as much as possible noise leakage right between the rooms. And also the smaller or the smallest conference rooms, the phone booth types, you want to make sure that you have the proper acoustical treatment, whether it's on the walls or panels or ceiling tiles that are acoustically treated, those type of things. All right. So I'm sure there are more here. These are the general ones that we look at when we're building standards and rooms, right? And if you have any recommendations, suggestions for additional ones, we, again, always welcome that. Okay, so let's talk about our 10 steps for building these standards. And we're going to start with, again, gathering the requirements. That's obvious. Talk to, folks that use the rooms. Talk to heads of departments and gather their requirements. And their requirements, in most cases, are going to be given or provided to you from a use case standpoint. They're not going to tell you what type of door you're going to use or lighting controls and all that. Nothing like that, right? They shouldn't. Even if you're talking to your facilities folks, they're still going to be users of the rooms, so they're going to provide you those requirements. Then, as you gather them, review them, organize them. You may have in a list, if you're going to have multiple meetings with multiple folks, now you have your list of requirements. And what you're going to realize is some redundancy, some let them speak, let your users, I wouldn't stop them. You want to welcome the feedback and their input. And so you're going to also realize redundancies and new things that you probably didn't think about. All right. If you look at bigger organizations like Google and Apple, and we visited their campuses, they have unique requirements too. Very unique, especially around room reservation displays, which is something I'm going to talk about in the second video, right? And availability of the rooms to certain groups. Some groups, they want 100% access all the time to specific rooms in the buildings. That's a requirement. Most folks don't, but if you work for a large organization and say you are in the engineering building, obviously most users will be engineers, and so you want to give them priority. But again, talk to your users about that, especially heads of departments. You're going to want to build your budget, both for CapEx and OpEx. The good recommendation here is if you watched our MDF video, MDF standards video, you probably can, if you haven't already, you can start using that template that you built. And soon what you're going to start having is these budgets that you're able to provide to planning folks as you're doing your forecasting, when it comes to budgets. So build your budget. Um, Much like a budget, build your timeline for construction. You're going to work with your GC on that. And they're going to tell you, look, this type of room should take this long. And you build that into your overall schedule. And so that's also another tool that you want. Now you probably have enough information from steps 1 to 4 to start building that draft version. And I'm going to allow myself a plug here. We can help you with that. That's a service that we offer. So contact us and we will work with you side by side, or you can give us the project and we'll come back with a package. And our package, much like the MDF standards package, our package for conference rooms is nearly identical to the MDF. It includes elevations, includes a 3D view of your rooms, and you can place them in your standards package. All right. So number 6 is, again, you're going to want to review. Now that you have a draft, you have a project team, right, that you're working with in terms of these standards. Folks from your GC group, architects. If you have an interior designing team, you want to get their direction on colors and the type of tables and brands, and you can get down to that level. We do, unless we're told not to, but we do. So share with them and get their feedback. Again, just like you did in step 1, where you gathered your requirements, welcome their feedback. We're going to critique your design. It's okay. It's perfectly fine. We receive critiques sometimes, and we welcome them. Even if there are some that you're not going to use. You took note, from a VP, from a director, from a manager, from a user. Treat them all the same. That's what we do. After you review, now you're going to have a version 1.0. This is, hopefully, it's really finalized, right? In terms of all the features that you want, all the, the dimensions and sizes and whatnot. And you're able to show that and share that. Now you go back to your IT management team. They're going to have to approve this new standard. There's cost involved. There's time from your resources, your project team involved, right? So review it with them. They too will have feedback, inputs, corrections, upgrades. They too will. And at this point, they shouldn't, but you could be surprised. If you use our service, we'll handle this for you as well. We'll be there to help you go over the items and decisions if you want us to. All right. Number 9 has to do with approval, right? Since you did 8 and reviewed, you now want to get a final approval on the standard. Unless your IT management team can provide that, if you have a CIO or if you have a VP of IT, and you are now seeking that formal approval. And I mean formal because, again, it's going to be at some point part of your EA, enterprise architecture, right? And so involve your architects, your IT architects as well. They may have inputs. We always do. Unless you don't have that team or that individual, we sometimes play that role for you. Okay, and then once it's finalized, it's approved, publish it. You probably have your own ways of publishing, standards like this one. And so this is your chance. You're going to communicate it as well, right? To some groups. And I don't know that everyone in the organization needs to know that you have a new set of conference room standards, But for those that are involved and have input, they do. They do have to be aware. Okay? So, this is it, guys. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed the content and are able to make use of it. In the next video, as I mentioned before, we will review a sample of a small conference room and get you the details. I hope you can watch it, and if you like this content of this video, please give us a like and hit subscribe if you would like to stay up to speed with our deployment, our sharing of content like this one. All right? Have yourselves a great day. Thank you.